I'm going to share should I share my screen now?
No, I'll just do a quick intro and then we can go into
Okay,
it. That's all right.
cool.
So,
Sounds cool.
good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. Delighted to have Huw White here to lead this session. Um, there's there's a chat box, so if you have any questions, you can bung them in there. Or Huw is we had a good chat the other day, and Hugh's really keen to make the session revolve around what you like want to know about. And so, if you find something and you want to ask questions, please just we're very happy if you unmute yourselves and ask away, and we can kind of adapt the session kind of as it goes. Um, Huw is a professional library and media music composer. He's had much of his music on loads of bits of TV, credited through libraries. He's got albums with EMI and others. He writes bespoke music to a brief, or just makes albums himself, and then people can use them however. It's going to be a really fascinating session. You can see, so Hugh's joining us from his home studio where all of the magic happens, and yeah, we're going to go from there. So Huw, I'm going to hand over to you. Welcome and thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm just going to, should I share my screen now?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, and one other thing is that we are recording this session, so if you want to revisit it again, I'll make sure the link is available. So yeah, Huw, what are we doing today? What's going on?
Yeah, so I've got this piece. If you were with us on, was it Tuesday? We had a little
Yeah,
pre-chat
the
about
Facebook
things.
chat. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, wanting to keep it basically real to what is actually going on in my working life at the moment. And so I've been working on this production music album for EMI Production Music. We can talk a little bit more about exactly what that means as we get into it. And this particular album set of new commissions is it's literally called Space actually. So it's um, 12 tracks I think that are all supposed to be written with usage in music. Sorry, television featuring anything to do with space in mind. So this particular track is called Mission Control. And yeah, that's what I'm going to be taking us through today. But before that, just a little bit more. If you're not familiar with what library music is, it's basically an online digital library of pre-recorded music. It covers a range of styles and genres and moods, well, the whole gamut basically. So if you go up on, just check out any music library online, such as EMI, obviously, Universal Production Music, Audio Network, and you'll see that you can search basically anything you can think of by keyword, by category, by composer, and you'll find literally anything you're looking for, from kind of remakes of Bach and Beethoven to kind of acid jazz and everything in between. So yeah, so this particular piece, as I said, is for the EMI production music library. And the current stage that it's in is that everything's been written and recorded. So this particular track features quite heavily features orchestra. So the strings and the brass of the orchestra have been recorded during COVID. That was obviously done remotely. The recordings happened in Budapest with some great musicians out there. So what you're going to hear today is where the track's at just before getting that audio back, which is actually quite handy because it sort of reveals a bit more about how it's put together using MIDI and those kind of techniques before you get to the very end mix, which once that's all done and mastered, I'm happy to share that with you so you can see the end result as well. So yeah, just be talking through my process of how I got to what you're about to hear and why I got there, and hopefully some things that will, if you guys are interested in this kind of thing, that will give you an insight into how you might be able to do something similar should you want to as well. How's
Huw,
that
that
sound
sounds
anyway?
great. And so as we kind of go through, we're going to dive into the piece shortly.
Mm-hmm.
If people have questions or want to, and I've stop you ask specific things, how do you want us to go about that? Do you want us to like stop you as you go, or should we ask them in the
Yeah.
chat? What would be better?
Yeah, feel free to jump in at any point. yeah, it's more about giving you guys what you want to know, really, and I think that's the most helpful thing. Obviously, I've got an idea of what I want to try and communicate. But yeah, other than that, just yeah, please do jump in and ask anything. Don't be afraid to do that.
Nice. So when you showed me this track the other day, the first thing that I kind of saw was the scale of it, because if I'm making my own music, I'm dealing with maybe 10 12 tracks maximum, or if I'm arranging something for a band, like 20 tracks or something, if a small orchestra or something, or even the few bits of large orchestral stuff, you've got 30 tracks or something to worry about. But already on one screen I can see 33, and that's not even, that's just wind and brass. So
yeah,
like, can you just talk about the scale of it a bit before we, or do you want to play the track first? What's up to you?
No, I'm happy to address that briefly. So yeah, it's not unusual for, I mean, some kind of Hollywood composers will have, well, just composers in general, but specifically film composers will have entire templates loaded the whole time. And there's a whole plethora of information out there as to how you do that in terms of managing to, managing your systems to be able to do that, which I won't get into. But I mean, some of those templates can run into the thousands, and they're just always there, so you have access immediately to whatever instrument you want, whether it's kind of like like an ethnic flute duduk or something, or a particular type of taiko drum, or a particular synthesizer patch, or whatever. So it's not unusual, particularly when you're in hybrid music, which is kind of like orchestral music crossed over with synthesizers and sound design and everything. It's not unusual for the tracks to be big, and this is big, but it's not by any means the biggest thing. And also remember that the track count is taking into account, they're not all just instrument tracks. There's bus tracks and effects tracks and different outputs. Like, these are all just the different outputs of the different section. So you see there's nothing written on these, because all these do is play back the different sections, but they still go into the track count. So yeah, I think I will play it through, because I'll get to, it looks a bit overwhelming probably at first glance, but I'll get into what's going on. But maybe it would make most sense, rather than conceptualizing it, to just hear it first, and then we'll go from there. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Awesome. And I think this whole sort of, this screen up here dying kind of seconds before this started is kind of a lesson that things do go wrong in this, well, in any industry. But it's nice because it kind of keeps it real. Like, none of us are immune to that kind of stuff. So yeah. Anyway, here's the track. So off we go. So there you go.
It's
First
pretty
things
epic.
thanks, Neil. Yeah, I think we're getting the little glitches we're getting. I think are probably to do with Zoom. There's a few little. Don't know if you heard that. A few little.
We also
glitches,
discovered that you may or may not get all of the panning that you've put in. So if you're in headphones and stereo,
Yes.
you may or may not be getting that through. We haven't worked that one out on Zoom yet. I
Yeah,
wonder if
unfortunately.
anyone who's watching has any kind of like reactions or kind of immediate first reactions or first questions before we start breaking down the process. If anyone wants to in the chat, or if anyone wants to ask or say anything like what that, yeah, just I guess just first reactions. If anyone would like to, then now is the
like the texture of it.
Cool.
Like the texture of the in the orchestration.
Awesome.
anything specific you're kind of you're thinking about?
This is like, because this is not my field. I'm not used to doing music this way, but I know it's like the same if you just write straight for an orchestra as well. Thinking about textures, because it's very clearly belonging to a tradition that already exists because of sci-fi and stuff. We know how music about space is supposed to sound, and then you can like weave that in. I'm going to be honest, I haven't heard any of your other music, so I don't know if like you have a particular sound you go for every time, but for me this did the trick instantly.
That's great. I mean, that's great to hear because that's kind of what library music is supposed to do, isn't it? It's you're trying to hit a certain style, and that does mean that there's going to be certain not cliche things, but there are certain techniques which you don't want to deviate too far from if you're trying to communicate a specific sound world instantly, which is what we are trying to do to aid the picture.
In direct
there is
go on, Håkan.
Yeah, sorry. Well, there is a tradition there, isn't it, of like space music, and I feel like the big thing there is that kind of non-human like texture that you get there, like the plings and the plong sounds, which work for me at least. They worked exceptionally well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, with this piece being called Mission Control, and I was going to get onto this actually, is one of the specific things that I had in mind that I was trying to do with the arpeggiated synthesizers that you hear all the way throughout, but especially at the beginning. I'll just play it just from here, just so I can demonstrate. Particularly this track. I was imagining kind of the lights on the machinery and the equipment in the control room, and also maybe in the actual space shuttle, kind of all going off not at random, but like because every element's doing its own thing, but when they interact it gives this kind of like feeling of slight chaos, but like an organized kind of mad scientist kind of chaos. So that was the sort of the idea behind that. And then the orchestra itself and the harmony that's used in particular is what brings the human element into it. So yeah, that's the kind of idea of it. Has anyone else got any thoughts before I just plow into what I want to do?
Hiya. Oh, sorry. I just noticed you're sending to bus 104. I'm assuming you don't have 104 buses going. If you see on the left, what on earth?
Yeah, so it's let me see how many buses are actually active. A lot of them. No, I don't have. Yeah. What's going to 104? So this will be to do with my reverbs, the way that I use reverbs. So I have a system where it's not always like completely locked in, but at the moment, my main stems go to buses 1 to however many stems there are, which is usually no more than, well, it's not, yeah, it's usually no more than 10.
Yeah.
And it's often, I try to keep it to 8. So like in fact, that's kind of a good segue into just how I was going to take you through the track actually, because I can explain all that So I think I'll just take you through my template to in general.
Cool. Yeah.
So first thing first, I'm working at, you notice up here, I'm working at 48 kilohertz sample rate. That's because that is TV standard. So everything that we deliver has to be at 48 kilohertz. CD quality, as I'm sure you probably know, is 44.1. And these days, a lot of music is made at 96 or higher, but for television, this is the protocol. And we deliver in 24-bit as well. So won't spend too much time talking about that, but it's good to know that 48K 24-bit is the standard. And then the way that I've organized my session, if I close everything up, that'll probably make it more manageable. So these top level folders here, there'll be 10 of them. Right, now we can see what's going on. So these are basically the food groups of this piece. So they do what they say on the tin, basically. So winds, brass, 3 different types of strings. So, I mean, really, it's winds, brass, strings, percussion, synth, sub, and sound design. But because I haven't used guitars and I haven't used 1 or 2 other things that I might normally have on their own stem, it gave me the freedom to dedicate a stem to these different string articulations. And also because the way that this piece is written, the strings are quite discrete like that. So it is quite clear when there's a section of strings that's doing an effective thing. There's a section of strings doing long sweeping melodies, and there's a section of strings doing short ostinatos. So doing it this way means I have complete control over those elements of the mix. And there isn't a lot of percussion in this, but it's generally helpful to separate out the tuned and untuned, so that when you deliver stems, you don't necessarily want to have like piano and harp and glockenspiel and things like that on the same stem as big drums, because it may be that a producer really likes the melodic elements but doesn't want the big drums in, for example, or vice versa. But even just in terms of how I'm thinking when I compose, it's helpful sometimes to have that separation, so I can think, right, I'm dealing with this section now and this section here. So these in Logic, these top level folders are called, before I say that, actually, these output stems match. So these output tracks, which are buses 1 to 10, you'll see here bus 1, bus 2, all the way down to bus 10, which is just an organizational thing. They could be any bus number you want them to be, but I do it like that because it just helps me to keep my head on top of where things are. They match these, but these folders don't actually output anything, because these are basically VCA controllers, which, if you don't know, is voltage controlled amplifier. But for all intents and purposes, all that means is they only control the volume of everything within them, but they also handily act as folders. So this track here in Logic is called a track folder, and as I say, it's for organization, and it has its own fader here, but all it does is control volume and mute and solo. So you can't do any mixing. You'll see there's nowhere to put plugins or anything like that. You can make it part of a group if you want, but yeah, I literally use it just to mute and solo, and generally to control volume. And the way that this is particularly handy for controlling volume is that it also changes the input level that it receives. So if I bring the volume down on this, then the meters in each of these channels will reduce, which is really helpful, because if I'm getting clipping like all over the track, or the general volume of the track is too hot, all I do is just using command, grab each of these and pull them down, and the heat of everything will come down. So moving on from there, so this is the top level. Then the next level down are these folders. So these are folders within folders, and in Logic these are called summing stacks. But basically what they are instrument buses for everything within them. So for me, I break it down into whatever is the next most logical lower level to organize things by, which in this case was long winds and short winds. You can be as specific as you like, or organize it however you like. Sometimes you might decide that you want to have control over the high winds and the low winds, or the high long winds and the high long winds and the low long winds, and etc. But in this case, because I was only really dealing with high woodwinds, I've just split them into long and short. So within each of these summing stacks, subfolders, you have a set of instruments that all have a commonality. And if I open the mixer, it'll probably help as well. You can see that it doesn't matter what the bus number is. The bus number will be assigned automatically based on whatever order it, as I'm composing. As I create the bus, it will just assign it automatically. So I don't worry about those bus numbers, but I like to keep the top level ones clear, what they are: 1, 2, 3, etc. Does that make sense so far in terms of answering that question?
Yes, sorry.
Great. So I'm just going to keep taking you down. I don't know how familiar you guys all are with this kind of composing. So I'm just going to take you down through the layers of complexity. So we've dealt with the output tracks, the output stems, the VCA folders which match those stems, and then within each of those we're starting to get into instrument groups that are on their own bus. Oh, by the way, this is the level that I do most of my mixing at in terms of inserting mix plugins, is on these. So rather than to each instrument, you'll see there's no mix plugins. This is just the instrument plugin here. There's no mix plugins on the actual instrument. Sometimes I will put something on the instrument if it needs it, like an EQ or a special effect, but generally I group them and then apply the same effect to that whole group of instruments, which in this case I've used this old EMI Abbey Road emulation, and this channel is great, the TG12345, which is just compression, EQ, stereo spread, that kind of thing, but it has a nice kind of analog emulation which particularly works well on orchestral tracks. I'm not going to talk loads about mixing today, but it's just so you can kind of see roughly what the process is. And then on each of these instrument channels, generally they're individual instruments, sometimes they are groups of instruments. So this is 3 flutes playing together on one patch, and these are all Spitfire audio instruments, by the way, and which are awesome. And this is actually a blend of woodwinds on one patch, so there's not much woodwinds in here, but it sounds like this on its own. On its own, that's pretty piercing and not massively enjoyable, but that comes at a moment in the mix where take it out, you'll hear the difference. So yeah, so moving down, then we have short woods, and with my short articulations I tend to firstly use a little bit less reverb. So that's another thing to mention actually, is that I send my reverb each stem. So when I'm using the word stem from now on, I'm kind of talking about everything within each of these groups, and obviously the way that they output, this is the actual stem. But yeah, with the wind stem and every stem, I generally give them their own reverb, discrete reverb, so that I can control exactly how I want each one to sit in the room as it would in a hall. Won't get into too much detail about that, but yeah, with the long winds I'll send a little bit more than the short, just so that it doesn't get too washy. If I want short winds to stand out, and then the long ones are a bit dry, a bit wetter, sorry. Yeah. So when I hit stop, you can hear it ringing for a bit longer, and that's quite a common thing to do. Also, sometimes on my shorts, I'll add a little bit more compression just to tighten it up. Here I've actually got even a bit of distortion on the shorts, just so that they punch through the mix. Because obviously, if you've got loads of tracks playing long articulations and they're all affected in that way, they're all like in your face, then nothing's gonna come through. So you have that kind of blend, and then on the long stuff, and then a lot of my kind of short ARP synthesizers and short strings and stuff like that will have a little bit more compression, or sometimes even expansion. Even if I want a little bit more of the attack, I might even expand, which is the opposite, but it has its place. So moving down, we've got brass, a lot more brass in this. We recorded all this live. So being kind of like a big space piece, I mean, you don't have to look further than the planets to know that there's a history of using big brass to kind of communicate that. So on their own, in a big section, in the biggest section, they sound like this. And I'm sure you'll agree that those, considering their samples, they sound great. It's Spitfire symphonic brass. Yeah, so just to take you a little bit further from the macro to the micro, so within each of these instrument tracks, generally I'm using Contact 5 as my sampler, although some libraries have their own dedicated sampler plugins. And then within that, you then can choose which library you want to use and which instrument patch within that library you want to use. And then those libraries themselves are stored on a bunch of external SSDs that I've got hidden away down here. A quick one on using particularly orchestral samples, but samples in general. If you can, these days you want to run them off SSDs, again, which is something I'm sure most of you know, so that you don't run into problems with the streaming speed, because particularly on a track like this, there's so much being pumped in real time into my computer to process, in terms of, you know, basically just audio files of each of these samples for every note, that you want that to be as quick as possible. So investing in SSDs is one of the most important things you can do to achieve that. Stripe together to run even quicker. Just a little tip to look into if you're interested in that. And yeah, I think that's basically the gist of the idea for the template. And because yeah, once everything that I described for winds and brass kind of repeats, so in the strings effects, that's things like tremolos and harmonics. So I've separated, obviously there's only one harmonics track here, but I've just separated them out for organization and mixing again. And they're within FX because I consider, you know, something that's only doing a tremolo that I've put loads of reverb on and a bit more processing is an effect. Yeah, so that sounds, just quickly give you a bit of that so you can hear what that is doing. That kind of Atmos thing. Again, you know, atmosphere is really important when dealing with space. And then we've got long strings. This is kind of like all the melodies and stuff. In tandem with the brass, so oftentimes cello will double with the French horns, violins might double with the trumpets, that kind of thing.
Are all the strings Spitfire audio?
For this particular one, a lot of them seem to be. I do use a lot of Spitfire. This is.
Am I right in saying they're free, aren't they? Is it just the strings that are free? I think I don't know if it all is.
Unfortunately, these aren't. But I think are you referring to the BBC Symphony Orchestra?
I might be, yeah.
Yeah, they have. They're Spitfire are awesome. They do. Yeah, they do a free version of the Symphony Orchestra, which has basic functionality covered. So you don't get. Right. I think you don't get legato patches, maybe, but you get like enough to, you know, really compose a decent orchestral piece with, which is amazing. And yeah, I'm without going too far into it. Yeah, the BBC Symphony Orchestra thing is great because you can, if you're, for example, sharing a project with me and I had the pro version, which is obviously paid, if we were passing the project back and forth, it automatically figures out what you own on your free license, for example, and it will swap out the sounds. So you can so you can keep working on it. So a little advert for Spitfire because I do like it, and they're kind to me sometimes. So they're always kind to me. Here is what I'm using on the lead instruments. So this is from Symphonic Strings, which is kind of their biggest orchestral library in terms of volume of players. Well, certainly in terms of traditional orchestral stuff. I think the Hans Zimmer library, which I have, probably has more. Is a specific kind of use. Yeah, so these are all Spitfires. You can see SFSS, which means they're all Spitfire Symphonic String. And then these things down here are from an older library called Iceni from the Albion range. And this is like, for this patch, I think is cellos and celli, I should say, and double bass recorded together. And I don't use loads and loads of these multi-patches, which is bunches of instruments recorded together, because I like to have complete control over each individual instrument. But sometimes if I know, well, I know that I want, when I'm going to orchestrate this, I'm going to want the cello, the cello and the double bass playing in octaves, then I might as well use that patch, because A, it saves time, and B, because when they're recorded together, it will actually sound better than using two individual patches where you've got double the room sound, and you know just the musical blend's going to be better. So that sounds like this. These are all Iceni actually, because not because they're just doubling over and over again, but because I've got a few counter lines, which is unusual in low strings to have that, because it can get muddy, but it was what I was going for here. So there's a bit of mixing to do. I haven't gone like super crazy with the mixing, because I know that I'm going to have live strings coming back into this session, so there's no point trying to make it absolutely perfect yet. You can hear some portamento and stuff, which is like slidey lines, which is amazing that they're programmed into the library, and obviously you can choose. Here it's actually in the patch, so it will always do them. There's other ways that you can program them in otherwise. So that's sounds like this. And just a little kind of MIDI programming thing. You can see break here. It's because I didn't want a slide here. So if you join them up like that, you can hear the slide, but where the breaks are, there's no slide. Obviously that can sound a little bit abrupt with MIDI, but it just helps me to remember when I come to orchestrating where to write in those.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you'd automated that or not, because I could hear when it was doing the portamento and then it stopped. So, but that's cool. Yeah,
that's cool. And on some of the Spitfire, I think most of the legato patches actually, where you have, rather than just selecting the portamento layer, but you've just got everything loaded in the legato patch. I think if you cross them over like that, that means they perform legato. And I think if you pull the velocity all the way down to 1, I think it will do it portamento. So there's lots of little
that's so cool.
nuances like that, which we could spend literally all day talking about, and not get any further into this. So put that back before I forget. So moving on, we have, and here I've just separated out the strings ensemble long. This means everything you see so far in the strings long group stem has been legato patches, because they're all playing their own individual lines. So when, together they make up oftentimes a harmony, but rather than me just playing them in like, a chord, on one patch or in a few patches, that the individual lines all work together to create the vertical harmony. But here, this is just an ensemble patch, which means there's no legato. So if I tried to play a chord on a legato patch, it won't let me. Let's go that one. It'll kind of cut the notes off because it's only programmed to be sort of monophonic, but really it's, yeah, it can only play one note at a time and go in between whatever you're playing. If I try and play all those notes together, it will quickly just swap to whatever was the first one I actually pressed. Whereas with an ensemble library patch rather, you can play whatever you want. So that's the Spitfire Classic, which is the flautando. I think it's probably chamber strings. Yeah, long flautando, which is sort of a well-known, awesome sounding passage for flautando. Is when the whoops, my microphone's falling off. Is when a string player plays flute-like, literally flautando means, so very lightly on the string away from the bridge, and you get this really nice airy sound. I'll just play you a bit of this. And that works quite well actually with the affected stuff. So then we have string short, which I mentioned is on its own stem, and again just high. In fact, there is no low short strings in this, so I've split them up in terms of function. So I have high strings, and then this filt means filtered, because the end section I wanted to apply a high pass filter. Sorry, no, a low pass filter. I mean, to the strings. And I could have just done that by automating it on the one track, but it was just easier to treat them as separate entities. So the strings do an ostinato, which kind of builds up the momentum. In fact, to begin with at least, they double the synth. So when I first started writing this piece, the original, just jumping down to the synth stem, the original idea was just this track. I remember when this session was just this one track, and the idea came from this, just messing about. And that just repeats, you can see. I don't use loop an awful lot, because if I do, and then I decide I want something to be different later, you then have to recopy the file or, undo the loop. And I find it better just to kind of have the MIDI there to alter however I want to as I go. Another thing you can do, actually, this is just a quick tip, is create an alias. So I think that's the key command. So yeah, if you do Shift and Alt, now whatever I write in here will automatically be copied to here, because this is an alias. But yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Can I just ask about how you haven't separated the long notes and the short notes because of restraints within Spitfire? It's because of your effects channels and stuff, because in the free version that Catherine mentioned before, I don't think you can have different you can't have staccato and legato on the same, you can't affect that on the free version, but can you do that in the full version on the same channel?
I think what you mean is, so on the BBC Symphony Orchestra plugin, which I've only used on the wings for this one.
Yeah.
If I open that plugin, you have here all the different articulations.
Yeah.
Which you can either key switch between, or however you're triggering them.
Sure.
MIDI channel or whatever, and that all happens on the one track.
Cool.
Or if you prefer, you can have those articulations on individual tracks. They can be within the same stem or on different stems.
Okay, cool. I think that's the main thing that you don't get with the free one. Just as a heads up to anyone who's got it, you can't have one channel with short and long notes. You have to separate.
So when you open this window up, you only have the option to open like one articulation in here. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
So like, if anyone's familiar with like the Logic Studio strings or horns, you get a drop down menu of different articulations per MIDI. Whatever you've drawn in as MIDI, you can have different notes doing different things, but on the free Spitfire stuff, you don't get that. So it's definitely worth getting the full version.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know because I've got the pro version, but I mean, I definitely recommend. Yeah, I definitely recommend it. I mean, it's awesome software. So yeah, thanks for that. But yeah, I mean, in a sense, that's an interesting point because I was talking to Neil about this the other day. Actually, it's definitely kind of a very common industry thing in film and television in particular, with things like strings, that you would separate out the long and shorts, and a mix engineer would like to have the long articulations and the short articulations separate so that they can treat them differently in the kind of ways that I described. Like the reverb might be applied slightly differently, even though like when an orchestra is playing in a hall, you wouldn't suddenly have the hall sounding different, changing shape when a string player plays staccato. Something like this track isn't. We're able to write music like this because of technology, and you would never be able to put all these synthesizers and like sound design things and an orchestra in a hall and for it to sound like it makes any sense. Like it wouldn't. So you have to get away from that kind of I don't know what the word is now, but hanging on to those kind of sensibilities for dear life. But that said, the limitation of that, and it doesn't matter for this piece because the concept was to have very clearly like these string ostinatos are doubling that short synthesizer idea that I started with, and then the longs are doing their own specific thing. But it kind of breaks down when you're writing more through written orchestral music where like a string line might go from playing staccato really fast to legato to marcato notes to pits, all within the one line. And if you're doing that, obviously you can't break them up like this because you'd literally be taking a musical line and breaking it up across different stems, which doesn't make any sense at all. And there are actually some libraries which I find for that kind of writing I defer to a bit more. Don't want to go too much down the rabbit hole of that, but yeah, for this particular track, the Spitfire was doing the job great. So yeah, also I don't use symphonic strings that often. Actually, I find it can be almost too big and too washy. But because I wanted the contrast between this kind of upfront, in your face synth stem and the orchestra, it works well. So let's play it from the beginning so it can trigger everything properly. So yeah, there is some reverb and effects on there, but by and large, that all feels fairly like close, doesn't it? And like you're in that kind of control room environment, slightly tense. I actually just want to take you through a little bit more through the actual overall concept of the piece, because it's important to kind of get into the nitty gritty when you're looking at something this big, but actually we haven't really talked about the form of it or the concept of it. So I'll just take you quickly through that, if that's okay. So basically the macro form of the composition is essentially two slow building ramp ups split by a cut point here. So from here to here, that's one ramp up, and then we have little break here, which is very, very common in library music, is to have these kind of cut points. So what I've drawn in is like a little fade out and a little fade in, which just helps me to see that's a moment where one section can be, you know, faded out by a producer, and then this section can be faded in if needed. So I'll just play this first section once more. And this, by the way, this is essentially a fade in, but it's like a 1 bar textural rise into where the actual content of the music starts, which is here. And again, that's really common, not just in library music and all types of music, but it particularly helps with scene transition. So if you imagine that there's one scene that's coming to a close, the scene that this track's going to be used on is beginning, and it's a completely different mood, then you don't want it to be too jarring. If they want it to be jarring, they'll just cut it straight in here where the synth starts, but this is helpful for transition. So I'm just going to play it from there up until here once more, and then talk you a little bit more through it the next bit. That gives you the ability to just fade out with the tail if you wanted to, or fade in here if you only wanted to use this section in the production. So the reason that I've done these red, orange, and green is kind of to give a little visual cue as to what's going on. So traffic light thing, basically. So this is fairly static. You know, it's just establishing the mood, the sort of setting the scene, really. We're not looking to suddenly like build anything. So the synths come in, a few little glitchy layers and that come in. The orange is like get ready, basically. So the melody starts, which I've called the exposition. So that's kind of like exposing, revealing what the actual content of the track is. And then here the counter melody comes in, which is the brass, just so we can identify the melody, because we haven't actually talked about that. I think the strings carry it here, so we'll just hear that melody. Violins and the upper strings, well, in fact, yeah, it's violins, violas, and cello in octaves. So this first melody has been carried by low strings, so cello and bass, and then upper cello and violins and violas join the brass on the counter melody. So I'll just solo that and the brass, which comes in here. So can you hear those two melodies, how they work together? And then basically we have this break, and then it all kind of, so we have this big build through here. You know, the synths set the scene with the affected strings, then the melody joins and things build a little bit, and then the counter melody, and then climax kind of here, but we don't actually resolve it. It's left hanging like this. Which means when it does come back in here, you know that we've got somewhere to go, and you're kind of subconsciously hungry for it because we haven't had a resolution. So when it starts back here, there's a more urgent synth that comes in. Which is, I think is it the Moog? Yeah. So this is my Moog Sub 37, which is always fun to get involved.
Do you think like mostly vertical or horizontal when you arrange this? Because it sounds like those very hard textures have like a real strong horizontal direction.
Yeah, that's a really good
so
question.
That when the sound sort of dissipates, if that works, then the fact that they are so hard makes it like a very abrupt. Yeah. It's not just vertical, it's horizontal as well.
That's absolutely right, yeah. I can talk a little bit about the harmony because there isn't really much to it. And you're right, this is very much a horizontal, horizontally developing composition. And that might seem like a strange thing to say when you've got all these tracks, but when you think about horizontal development, it's basically rhythmic development. So as each one of these things comes in, not so much the brass and strings, but certainly the synths and bits of percussion and stuff, it's not there doubling something else or adding a harmonic layer to something else. It's more adding rhythmic texture, and it's more adding like another groove, another element that's rhythmically counterpoint to what's going on. But the actual harmony itself is really simple. So yeah, we basically have 4 chords really that go throughout, which are A minor, 2 bars, then F sharp minor, then F major, just repeats. A minor for 2 bars, F sharp minor, F major. So can you guys hear the piano? It's internal.
Is there a pedal point there, or am I just hearing that in my head?
What? There's not like a bass. Do you mean like a pedal bass hanging on a certain note?
No, just a pedal note anywhere, because it's like I think I'm hearing it, but it might just be in my mind.
It may, yeah, probably some of the rhythmic synths are probably sticking around like the tonic quite a lot, but not in a way that it's like the bass line is clearly staying on A, like the bass is moving generally. But some of the, let's have a listen through the synth and see if we can identify what you're talking about. Yeah. It's there. That kind of thing. It's just staying on an A.
Yeah, that's maybe what I'm hearing, because that also makes it sound more like floaty in a way.
And that leads me to my point about how the harmony actually works. So they're unusual chords, but they hang together on the fact that they all share the tonic note. So now what I'm doing here is I'm putting this in low latency mode, so that when I play the it real time for me, rather than, because I run with the maximum latency all the time because of the size of the projects, and I don't know why it's opening the window somewhere else. I think because my other monitor's bust is opening up there. Never mind. So I run on, I think it's 1024 samples of latency, which is the maximum in Logic, which means that if I try and play, that's almost like a second late for me. So when I want to record, just quickly have that on, and it turns off unimportant plugins so I can record in real time. Does that make sense? Which means that I don't have to worry so much about all the mix plugins and stuff that I have running.
Huw, can you just explain what you mean about the A being the common note, just so that we're ultra clear of that? Okay, cool.
Yep. So A minor, as I'm sure most of you will know, is A in the bass, the third, which is a C, and the fifth, which is an E. And the second chord is unusual because it immediately takes us out of A minor, which because it's F sharp minor. It's kind of F sharp minor 7, really. But it works because you've still got the A in it, which is the tonic, and with the 7th there, that's the 5th. So that's, you can have that pad all the way through, and then it goes to F major 7. So it hangs together on the fact that these two notes are there the whole time. And you can't have space music without a harmonic twist either. So, you know, like typically you get, you know, things like tritone movements, that kind of thing. So that was A minor to E flat major, back to A minor. So it's kind of taking you far enough away to, you know, to be really interesting and intriguing, but not so far that you can't get back again, kind of thing. So this whole piece hangs on that. And if I wanted to get really esoteric about it, it's almost like the A minor. I don't want this to feel sad. It's not a sad piece. It's more like an intrigue type piece. So when you have that immediate lift out of A minor to something that's almost a bit more major, because you go to the C sharp, which is the major third of A minor, but it's obviously a minor chord being F sharp minor, but it stops it from feeling sad because it's actually brighter. And then this is just like a cool way back to A minor, basically, and it brings you back into the Aeolian mode, which is, if you're familiar with your modes, is like the natural minor. So all the white notes, if you're in A, it has a flat 7, flat 6, and then the other regular minor notes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, and that is probably the most common mode used in, certainly in film music, is Aeolian. But yeah, this F sharp minor chord makes it a bit more interesting. And if the instrumentation was different, it would probably sound jazzy, but that wasn't what I was going for. Yeah, and it almost gives it that feeling when the orchestra comes in. I'm wanting it to almost sound like you're coming out from this control room into like a feeling of literally liftoff, and that raising the harmony like that gives you that sense of propulsion of like, okay, we're going somewhere. And then the F major chord constantly brings it back, becoming as if you're falling back again. So it's, yeah, to be esoteric, it's almost like lifting off and then landing and lifting off, landing. And when that happens all the way through the piece and the other textures build, it all comes together to give you this feeling of what's going on. And then when you get these moments of, the way I envisage this moment with the drop is almost like you could, if you think of this as being the red section here as being the control room, this is like starting the engines, you know, when the orchestra comes in, and this is lift off. And then this is almost like the moment that you hit space and you leave the atmosphere, and it's like suddenly all the rumbling stops, all the sound stops, and it's like, what's going to happen now? And then the journey starts again. So if you try and imagine that, I'll just play it from the second half of the climax here, and then imagine that at this point we've suddenly got through the atmosphere, and it's like a little bit scary, but like what's going on and what's going to happen next, kind of thing. And then the journey starts again. It's like, okay, now we're in space, now what, kind of thing. Let's get to work, people. And then because of that synthesizer that I brought in there, the Moog, which it is kind of there earlier, but now it's really exposed. And I think what I'm doing is opening up the cutoff, which is a common thing as well to kind of build tension. So if you're familiar with how cutoff filters work, it will kind of literally cut off whatever you set the frequency to be. So you're only hearing the low frequencies of the instrument. And then as you open it and you introduce high frequency content, it kind of opens up the aperture of the sound. And I've used that a lot in this piece. I mentioned the filtered short strings at the ending, because what I wanted to do on the second build is really have the aperture fully open by the time you get to this melody 2B, which is the climax, actually some of the, like the kick drum, for example, drops out. Some of the busy stuff drops out, so that all you're hearing is the fully filter open synthesizers and the fully open orchestra. So you're like, wow, this is the moment that it's like really epic and breathing. I'll just play you that again. So we've had this rebuild, orchestra comes back in. Because of the Moog coming in here, it's automatically more tense the second time round, because the tension's already here. It says tension. The tension's already there from the beginning. In fact, I'm just going to play you the whole of the second half, because then it'll make more sense me talking about it. So. There's more tense already. Also, that pedal note that you mentioned, sorry, I've forgotten your name. The chap that mentioned the pedal note. Hear it. You can hear it actually moves. It goes from an A up to a C on the F chord, and just that little change itself, it kind of signifies, okay, something a bit more is happening here. It's not quite so static. We'll go. See if you can hear that this time. It's that high. Goes up. And the cut-offs and the synths are opening the whole time. Trying to draw attention to is the cutoff filter idea. So here you can see that throughout this build section, the main lead synthesizer, which you're familiar with by now, is opening up from. So I'm using a plugin here, a really simple plugin called One Knob Filter from Waves, because it literally does one thing. And you'll see that this cutoff frequency, I mean, I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly what frequency this will be at right now, probably cutting off somewhere like 800 hertz or something like that. It opens all the way up to the full range, so like 20 hertz and upwards. And that sounds like this. So if I turn this off, it's just fully open, but I want it to get there in time for the horns. So by the time it's fully open, it arrives exactly at the moment of the climax, and then I can drop the kick out, and it actually feels bigger rather than smaller, because I've drawn attention to the fact that what I want it to feel is open and like wow, we're in wide open space. Does that make sense? And obviously brass, especially horns, they kind of affect the whole frequency range basically from their fundamental. So it's really rasping. And then, I was talking about the cutoff on the strings. So the other thing that, in terms of like a concept that I had with this piece, is that you can use frequency and filters to give a sense of distance. So high frequencies don't travel as far as low frequencies. So my concept was I wanted to make things feel up close by having, when the filters are open, everything is like in your face and up close. But after this climax, I wanted to give the sense of, because one of the keywords that I was given by the library in the brief for this was infinite. So I didn't ever want to get to a point where it's like, oh, now we've resolved and it's the end. So after the big climax, rather than doing a big ending chord, I've got this breakdown outro. Again, it's combining function with form, because library music, you want to have these different sections anyway, right? So I want to not just end it, but give them like a breakdown section that's like an extended outro anyway, because it's a different use that for editors. So but on this section, I basically put a filter on the strings so that it sounds like they're more distant. So like it's almost like this, you know, this spacecraft comes up to you, stares you in the face, and then it's like, but the journey's not over because space is infinite. So it goes off into the distance and everything fades out, and even the strings filter down in frequency. So just check that out. So I've got this filter there on the strings, which I could have done just with an EQ, you know, and then right off into the darkness of space kind of thing. So it's almost like the idea is to take you from this point of like wide open frequencies, and then everything's getting lower all the way down to this sub fall down to like a really low raspy sound, which is almost sort of, you know, it's kind of hinting to the kind of eternality of space, and a little bit dark, you know, a little bit like what's out there kind of thing. So yeah, does that make sense? I know I'm being a little bit kind of like jumping all over the place with my thoughts, but yeah, hope it's helpful.
What's your process for scoring when you come to score it? 'Cause I noticed you had a channel called Sibelius down the bottom.
Plotted, yeah. So my process with that is I do all my own orchestration. That's kind of my background. And the way I do it is I run Logic in rewire mode. Again, for some reason, I don't think it's going to let me show you this window because I think the other screen is still hogging it and not working. But if you go File, Logic Preferences Audio, there's an option to turn on rewire mode, which will take a minute because it will reload all of your samples again. And then if you have to make sure that Sibelius isn't already running. I use Sibelius, but I'm sure you can. There's ways that you can make this work with other software. And then when you launch Sibelius, it will launch in rewire mode, which means that Logic is its master, controlling the MIDI, and Sibelius is following along. And the Sibelius plays its audio back via Logic, provided that you've created this auxiliary channel for it to play on. And in here, you then just go to, you just tell it to listen to it. I think because it's not in rewire mode at the moment, it doesn't appear how it would. I didn't want to have it in rewire mode just because with doing the zoom and screen sharing and everything, I didn't want to give it too much to think about. The computer, that is. And yeah, so then this will appear, it will say Sibelius, and then you just click that, and now this channel will be, when you hit play, whatever you've got in Sibelius will play back through it. So I won't open Sibelius now, but just as a quick sort of overview of what I do, I'll open a new project, obviously in Sibelius. I will know what we're scoring for. So in this case, I've been told the number of strings, number of brass that we have. And so I'll put all those instruments in to begin with, and then we'll create, the first thing I do is create a load of empty bars from the beginning of the piece to the end and put in all these markers as double bar lines. So right from the off, it's not like fishing around, you know, like faffing about. You get everything in place. If there are tempo changes, I make sure that Sibelius is following those properly and that it's written in the score. It was specific in this brief that we didn't, if we could avoid it, not to have tempo changes, which again is fairly common in library music. I did do one track in here that had a lot, but generally speaking, just in terms of making it easier for producers to use, and therefore getting you more usage for your tracks, if you keep them all the same tempo, the same key as well, it makes it easier to cut, obviously. So this one is, if if I show you my tempo track, you can see there's no tempo changes. It's all at 108 BPM. And then from there, the way I do it is I work with I tend to separate out as much as I can. So I use quite a few overdubs, especially in a big session like this. I will record probably like all the string effects stuff separately, and this doesn't all as well. You have to remember this isn't going to translate directly to whatever players you've got, so you have to make some decisions about how you want to score it, whether there are some parts that you maybe don't need, or whether see something like that where there's two celli, whether it would be possible to divide it on the stand so each player plays a different part, or whether I might want to do it as an overdub. Something like this, in effect, I would almost certainly not do that as an overdub. So you've got, like, if say I have 12 cellos or whatever, eight cellos or whatever it is, I wouldn't want them all to be playing that and then all to be playing that. And if I did that for the whole session, you'd be there all day and you'd end up with this massive, dense, ridiculous sounding thing. So you have to make those decisions. Whereas something like this, these lead lines, I probably would like make sure that they were each recorded with a full complement of players so that they're really big. So that can mean that you have, I think for this session, for this particular track, I probably had like a couple, 2 or 3 actual separate string scores and separate brass scores rather than a score, because with all those overdubs, the score can fill up quite quickly. And if a conductor's only reading, for one pass, he only needs to read one, like one overdub. There's no point in having them all on the score, making everything really small. And also for us to look at in the control room. Does that make sense? So there'd be separate scores for those, within reason. Like I might put 2 or 3 overdubs on one score if it's still like nice and clear. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, so personally, I don't ever really export MIDI because I find for me, the scoring process is it's a kind of separate thing. So if I just grabbed all this, exported all the MIDI, created a load of tracks to match it and put it in, it wouldn't really mean anything.
Yeah, I imagine it actually creates more work in
exactly.
post.
Yeah, exactly. It's easier so I'll have one window generally when I'm working in Logic, this will be on my main window and I'll have my mixer and piano roll or whatever in other windows. And then when it comes to Sibelius, this one goes up the top. Sibelius is in front of me, so I can see them both. And so I'm constantly referencing back and forth and making decisions as I go. Yeah. And then obviously, don't know if you guys, do you know much about automating things like CC1 modulation, expression within sample libraries? I can talk a bit about that. Find something that's got it. I mean, strings will almost certainly have it. So this line that you see here, that's modulation, which in Spitfire libraries, so modulation is CC1, controls the dynamics here. So as this plays, let's just try and make this. I'll just play it from here. I should probably make this window smaller, but it is what it is for now. Solo this. You can see this moving, which is this automation, right? And it works differently for every library, but generally speaking, CC1 with orchestral libraries will be a dynamic change, but also it will tend to transition through the different recorded layers. So they may have recorded like the actual player playing piano, then the actual player playing like mezzo forte, then the actual player playing fortissimo as 3 separate samples. It probably, just for the sake of illustration, sometimes there's a lot more layers than that. Sometimes some libraries only have 1 layer, but CC1 will actually modulate between those layers. So when you hit, say, MIDI goes from 1 to 127, it may be that 1 to 40, which will be like anything under that, the recorded layer, the recorded sample that the library's the plugin rather is going to access is going to be that quiet recorded layer, and then it will do like a crossfade into the next layer as you move up, as well as increasing the volume within the plugin, and then maybe from like 80, 90 to 127 it will go into another layer, and then expression is just a volume control, so it doesn't change the actual layer that's being accessed. It just say I only want to use this dynamic layer, but I want it loud. I'll have expression up, but using that dynamic layer. And then this is an overall volume control, which is CC7, which is a bit confusing because you have lots of volume controls. CC11, which is expression, and then the overall volume of the plugin, and then of course the overall volume of the track. But I mean, having all of those different layers of gain staging basically is really helpful and really important to understand. So if if I have this all the way up here, I mean, Spitfire libraries are actually recorded quite quiet, so they have a lot of headroom. But if I have that up there and it's clipping here in the plugin, and it will go red here, I might be thinking, well, that's weird because like it sounds all distorted, but this is all the way down here. What's going on? So you have to check through all your layers and be aware of how it all works. Generally, having these quite low is a good thing to do, and then you treat the expression as you would a real instrument. So if I want it to be loud, I'll have it full. I tend not to use expression all that much, to be honest, actually. I tend to stick with modulation because it's actually affecting the dynamic layers. It's more musical. So yeah, I do use expression occasionally, but if I really want something to pop out, for example, if I really want it almost in an unrealistic way, as the dynamic is getting louder for the whole performance to get louder and then come down, I'll use expression. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Which of the string library would you recommend as a first purchase from Spitfire for a kind of an all-rounder, or for doing a bit of everything?
I think I'd have to. I think I'd probably have to say chamber strings still. Yeah, there are other libraries out there to consider as well these days. It depends what you want it for as well. I mean, Spitfire is great for kind of it's great for kind of like realistic orchestration, and it's great for having the sound of the room if that's what you want. So like all of the majority of their orchestral libraries are recorded in the hall at Air Studios, which is quite a characterful room, and that's in the samples, which is awesome. That can be problematic if you're writing like some trailer music or something and you need a really dry sound, because that's baked into the samples. That can actually be a problem area. For something like that, like I'm really enjoying Audio Imperia samples at the minute. So Jaeger is fantastic for that. It's like really musical library, but it's also quite dry and quite acrobatic as well. So sometimes with the wetter libraries, you'll find that they're not as acrobatic. So if you wanted to do, so this is a very sweeping piece, basic string ostinatos, so they're not like crazy fast, and the legatos, like they're long sweeping things, which Spitfire does really well. But if it was a trailer track with really fast biting kind of aggressive stuff and then maybe some faster legato passages, you might be better looking at something like Audio Imperia, or Performance Samples is another great up and coming company as well. And what they do really well as well is they respond, the articulations change responding to how you're actually playing. So it's not like you load a staccato patch and that's it. It will actually, probably through using, because they're very delayed libraries, so you have to set, after you've recorded, you have to set a sample compensation, so a negative delay. because it's responding in real time to what you're doing, which by definition means it has to be slightly delayed to be able to, figure out what you're doing. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. Are there any other questions at this point? Because we've probably got about 15 minutes or so before we're going to have to wrap up. So,
can I ask what your sidechain source at the bottom is affecting?
Yeah. That's a good question. Again, this is something that I don't do very often, mainly because, typically sidechains, and the old talking about sidechains in terms of like sidechain compression for getting pumping effects, things like that can be achieved quite easily using just a plugin on the track these days. So that kind of like drum and bass thing of like and the bass will get out, will duck out of the way of the kick. Obviously there's a little bit of that mood in this piece. It's not like a dance track, but I'll get to your question in just a sec. Sorry. Yeah, you can get where's the kick gone? Here. And it's really quiet because it filters in as well. This is the same idea. So at the beginning, we're only getting the very low, just so it doesn't start feeling like it's a dance track, but then this comes in. So by this point, you can almost get away with a bit of that underneath kind of thing. So what I think I did was down here, this is just audio of a different kick, probably. It was that long ago, I can't remember. I think it's probably just a loop or something. And then put the compressor on it, side chain. And this is audio channel 3. So then now I'm going to have to put an EQ on it so that it was affecting the compressor in the way that I wanted it to. That was just literally just messing about until I got the effect on the source track that I wanted, which was, gosh, I think it was the D50, which is another one of my hardware synths. This little baby down here, which this is actually baked into the audio now, so I won't be able to demonstrate it because I had this on a MIDI track, obviously, when I was recording the D50, and these were that was the channel that I used to do it sidechain return. So you can see that that's set to listen to audio 3, which is the source down at the bottom. And the reason I put it down at the bottom is because it doesn't need to sit in a stem, because obviously it's a trigger, and it doesn't have an output. It says no out because it's not, you can't hear it. If you could hear it, it would sound like this. So just a standard kick with an EQ that I put on. But you don't need to hear it because internally all it's doing is asking the compressor that's been affected by this silent kick to internally affect whatever instruments I want.
So is it just, in this case, the pad that you've...
I think there's a couple more. I'm just trying to think. Anywhere where it has sidechain return in the stem, it'll be because I'm sending an instrument to it. So I think this one, yeah, so the sidechain return is bus 41. Okay, so here you can see this is blue because I'm sending it post fader. So I've still got the regular output of this. So if I mute sidechain return, this is, I'm having to kind of reverse engineer something that I did months and months ago as well, so it's quite hard to remember everything, but and it's also really, really subtle what it's actually doing on the instrument. So that's just its own output, right? And if I turn, it does get louder, which is, let's just turn it up for now. You can kind of hear that slight pumping, yeah?
Yeah.
If I show you the compressor, it's moving really quickly. I think the video's struggling a little bit there. So that's what's giving you that. Because I didn't want it just to sit on a track like this, it's not, as I say, it's not a dance track, but I want those different elements, but I didn't want it just to sit there doing its thing loud and proud. I wanted it to be like a bit more esoteric than that, coming in and out. So does that make sense?
Yeah, entirely.
And I don't think there's many tracks. I think there's like 2 or 3 tracks that have that effect on. I'll play a bit of the D50 as well, so you can hear. A bit more obvious there. Now, I don't think you'll be able to hear it, but this has a really hard tremolo on it as well. I assume that you guys are just hearing stuff in mono through Zoom.
Yeah, it's not.
But yeah, this has the sidechain thing on, so it's pumping, but as well as that, it's got a very hard quarter note, 100% tremolo. So it's going left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. And I put a bit of smoothing on at 50%, which means that you're not having literally the left speaker go on, then the right, then the left. It's sort of a slight transition. And all those little things, especially things that create stereo width like that, are really helpful, so that a track starts to get big without getting overwhelmed, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I find it quite interesting how you're generally using quite a lot of just default Logic stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
again,
pretty, yeah.
This track I originally started writing like 2 or 3 years ago. So
Right.
So I probably have a bit more third party stuff going on now than I did then. But that said, like, there's not really any for me with a tremolo, like, this does what I need it to do.
Yeah.
So I have all the Sound Toy stuff, and some Sound Toy stuff on
here. Yeah, same.
But if I know I just want, well, on every quarter note, I want it to go 100% left and 100% right with a bit of smoothing. Like,
it does the job, then why? Why do you need anything else?
And it doesn't sound bad to me. It's not like it's giving some kind of unpleasing side effect. Same with the EQ. So I have the Pro Q3, only fairly recently, actually. But again, if I just want, a low cut and like a high shelf, then I probably now I would be more likely, particularly for the boosting, the high shelf, I probably would reach for the Pro Q3, because it does clearly sound a bit more pleasing. But something like this, I'm not going to go through the whole project and swap out all these EQs now just because I've got that, because it already all works. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I might have missed it at the start because I joined a bit late, sorry. But when you export, what are you exporting out? Just literally everything as a stem, or are you exporting the track stacks as well?
That's a good question. So with library music, this is actually probably a really good thing to touch on, because I think we've mostly covered like the nuts and bolts of the piece, like the instrumentation. We've talked about like a bit about MIDI programming. We talked about the harmony. We talked a bit about the form. So yeah, I think we've kind of touched on everything we need to musically. Yeah, when it comes to bouncing, so we have to deliver a full mix unmastered, because A, the label masters it in-house, but B, mastering isn't what you would typically think it to be. For TV, it's a specific thing, and actually you need to leave headroom so that it can be affected if they need to. So this master chain here is for my benefit and your benefit, so that it's, and actually probably I'll take off the limiter when I deliver the mix. Sometimes I'll actually leave some stuff on the mix, but what you have to bear in mind then is that when I deliver the stems, because you have to deliver all the stems individually, that when you sum them together, not me, but when whoever uses them sums them together, they will sound slightly different to the mix if you've left mastering plugins on. So I keep this really subtle, and occasionally I might run these stems out through an analog summing box just for the mix. But yeah, I did it once where I committed to doing the whole project like that, but I will never do that again, because it's just too time consuming, because you have to make So this is what I wanted to talk about. For library, you deliver a full mix and all the stems, but it doesn't stop there. You then have to deliver a 60-second version, a 30-second version, sometimes a 15-second version, and then at least one, preferably a few it's not stings, which are like, so the sting for this, or like my primary sting for this, is almost certainly going to be this. So like that in isolation, you could imagine that being, say there's a film trailer and they've got the piece of music they want, but the ending doesn't have the drama they want, or you want like a little extra kind of bit where it says coming this summer, whatever, the whole world's going to die, then something like that as a sting, just available in the library to quickly audition, is really helpful. So I'd literally, for that, it's not a case of just going, okay, great, I'll just do that and bounce it. You need to have a clean entry, and obviously if it's a 60-second bit, say for example I would decide, well, this is going to be my 60. I know it's not 60, but for the sake of argument. And also, as a side thing, if you have secondary, I think it's secondary ruler displayed in Logic, you can see the lengths here, which is really helpful in terms of time. So you can you can see that's 55 seconds.
So which bit would you choose in this case for like a 15-second?
Well, let's start with a 60. I would probably just hunt. I know that for a 60, generally, well, for a 60 and a 30, usually, but not always, I want the climax to be in there. So I want the ending to be the climax point. So I'll usually work back from there. So in this case, it could be here, because we get that big drop down after the horns. So this is like the magic of the piece here, but then there's the outro and the ending. So I might see, well, does that work? How long's that? 37 seconds. So no, that's not going to work. What about that? Okay, that's 55 seconds. So I might decide that I'm going to I'll just temporarily mute out whatever's here, just mute it all out so I don't get any like tails or overhangs or whatever. So I've got silence, and then start it from, say, not there, but somewhere like, so there's just you don't ever really want to start things bang on a beat, because plugins can do funny things if you do that. So I might bounce it from there with everything. I might have to cut some things, so I'll have to go in and see, well, what's that doing? Okay, so I need to do something to that MIDI to make sure that it starts cleanly, or maybe it doesn't want to be there at all if this is an overhang from a previous section. So all that to say is basically you get a nice clean start, nice clean end. So I don't want that coming in here. Like, I want to hear the tail. So I would just cut everything that comes in here out, so all you hear is the tail of the brass. And I could do something where like it finishes there, and if there's time, then put the sting on the end of it.
How often do they come back to you and say, we don't like that bit, can you choose something else, or make it slightly different? Or
so that would be the so when I work for EMI, there's a specific producer that I work with most frequently, and it doesn't happen very often, but he might say, could you just try again for the 60? I think we can get a better cut than that. But generally speaking, like, it's usually fairly obvious which are the bits that are going to work musically and kind of sell the best bit of the track. Because if I've got I'm doing a 15, I probably wouldn't give them this. Even though this sounds cool. It's a bit random.
Yeah.
So I guess the point is like you want to make sure you've selected your strongest bit, and sometimes that means actually cutting stuff up. Like, it's just not going to work. However hard you try, you can't get it to fit across a section that 60-second section that has a logical build, logical start point, logical ending, it might be it always comes out as like 50 or 1 minute 10, and you just can't get it to work. And in that case, you might have to do a cut or rethink. But to be honest with you, oftentimes now I'm thinking about that when I start writing. And actually, often the first thing I do when I'm writing a new library track is write the 60 and then work from there, because then I know because that's something that I can actually get my head around and bite off and chew. If you're thinking, wow, I've got to write a 3-minute piece of music that might end up being like, this is 150 tracks, that can be a bit overwhelming. But if I go, well, let's just start by writing a 30, right? So then I've got my climax, I've got my main melody,
and work from there. Yeah.
I tend to often write like everything first, like everything. Like I just build, add tracks. If it's a big piece, obviously. If it's just a piano piece, I won't do that. And then you've got to think from the beginning more compositionally. But with a track like this, where I know that it's mostly going to be about building textures and layers rather than harmonic development, rather than like sonata form, then I'll tend to end up pretty much like going vertical first and getting everything in, and then going back from there. And it may be that, as I say, I start with a 30, then bring it up to a 60, and then think, okay, now I need an intro, now I need an outro. Maybe I can double that section, put that there.
It makes more sense to work like that. Yeah, I get it.
So yeah, and then with those cuts, you don't generally need to deliver stems for each of those cuts. It will just be like, so a typical delivery folder will include the main mix, the stems of the main mix, then 60, 30, 15 stings, and then an underscore, which is basically like the whole mix, but with like anything melodic taken out, so it can sit under dialogue or whatever. And sometimes things like hits, so that would be more typical and like a trailery type thing. If there's like some big drum hits or something, or a single hit, or like a Brahm or a downer, that kind of thing, then sometimes you'd be asked to deliver them. But I think, unless I'm forgetting anything, that's everything. Yeah. Are there any further questions? Because I have to.
Yeah, I know you've got to head off here at some point soon. There was a question earlier from Ben, but he's left. But it'd be nice to answer the question quickly before the end. The question was, when you composed it, did you complete the first half before starting the second, or did you build them both together?
I can't, to be completely honest, I wouldn't be able to remember exactly with this piece, because I'm writing so many bits of music, and I finished writing this probably like a year ago, maybe 6 months ago. Before, because obviously, like when you finish writing, I'm talking about the programming side, and I do mix as I go as well to a certain extent. You have to with something like this, especially because the mixing is actually part of the composition. When you're talking about like filter sweeps and like tremolo things that are part of the. So I mix as I go generally, but that's only where it starts, because then there's the orchestration, and then there's the recording, and then there's the mixing, and then there's the making all of the stems. So like, it's a long process. So I can't remember exactly, but I kind of addressed it in my last point, the way that I approach it. So I know for a fact that I started with this synthesizer. I remember it, which is a retro synth, which is just a Logic. I have a Moog sat there.
Classic.
Sometimes, an idea stuff. Well, actually, I really like the synth. I like it because if for plucks, when you bring the cutoff right down and you get the attack, short, sustain, and mess about with the key and what have you, you can get quite a nice, this basically. And so that was the idea, and it's just. What I wanted was to get like unusual arpeggiation, so not just like a classic, 4-note chord that just goes, because I thought, well, that's been done to death, but also that doesn't have that element of chaos that I wanted to create in terms of like an active control room. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then here 7 notes, and then here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 again. So 6, 7, and a 7. With the arpeggiator set on, just Logic's arpeggiator set on 16th notes with this setting. And again, probably I just messed about with it. I knew I wanted 16ths. I knew the harmony that I wanted. And I probably just messed about taking taking notes out and, you know, with the order and stuff, until I had something that sounded interesting and irregular, but was regular every 4 bars. Because like what you don't want with library music, generally speaking, unless that's like the actual genre you're going for, you don't want to start doing something completely wacky that is going to turn people off, because it's not supposed to be the focus. It's supposed to support the picture. So this is already like quite probably like on the boundaries of how out there you'd want to be for something like this, especially once some of the other layers start coming in. And yeah, so my process was I wrote that, and then I probably started doubling it in the strings. And you can hear that I messed about by putting in some different kind of counter rhythms in the strings that kind of play off the synth and stuff. So these are all different layers of strings that come in with different levels of complexity. I'll just play that so you can hear that actually. So this here is doubling the first half only of the synth riff. So you don't, that's something that's quite good to do when you're building layers, is rather than just bring an instrument in that's suddenly just doubling everything and is like, you know, suddenly like the whole thing's overwritten. Just have the first few notes, then you can see I've muted it. I've obviously pulled this in from the synth and then gone, actually it's too much to have it playing all of it, so let's just have it play this bit. You can hear the synth carries on, strings back in, and then I finished the riff, but like just even there, just muted that one note because it sounded too busy in the strings, but the synth still has it. So you're drawing attention to certain parts of the pattern, and then the second line comes in here. And that's doubling the bass note of the synth. So each time it gets to the bottom of the arpeggiator, it helps that bass note stand out. Can you hear that? And now this is a classic example of using technology as an instrument, because I didn't technically sit down and think up this riff. Although it's quite funny that some of this has come out sounding like a version of Wayne Shorter's Footprints for, I think it was like a, maybe was it Allegria, the album? Anyway, a jazz album that has a similar bass line to this, a remake of Footprints, which wasn't intentional. It's just that I programmed the synth that way until it sounded cool, doing what I wanted it to, and then like drew out little elements from it, and orchestrated it in that way. And then obviously once it gets going, it's more traditional, kind of the melodic stuff is more traditional, like long sweeping lines that sit over the top of that mood. And then I'll just talk quickly about sound design stuff, because I haven't really, and the sub, I've got the sub on its own stem. Again, sometimes I just put the sub within the synths. I think you asked a question about, do I bounce these individually? No, generally no, but what it does mean is that if someone comes back to me and says, you know what, we just want the piano on a separate stem, for example,
you just mute it out. I
can just solo that and give them that as well. And then maybe if that was specifically requested by the library, they said, yeah, we really like it, but your synth, we want to have the lead synth on its own, then I would do a synth stem with, that's not the lead, but that's not the main lead, but let's just pretend it is, with that muted, and then I'd do it with it soloed.
So what about your effects buses with reverbs? Do you bounce them out as well? Because I know you can, but
yeah, that's a really good question. All these things, so I've written this order of how I wanted to take you through all this stuff, but I've just talked at random the whole time based on your question, which is great. But I think we've almost covered everything that I originally wanted to, and that was one of those points. So thanks for raising that. Yeah, the reason that I put part of the reason that I put the reverbs actually in the VCA folder stack stem is so that I remember to bust them out. Hang on, the mixer. So whilst they're also controlled by VCA, you'll see that these all go out to bus 1. Because as I mentioned, remember that the VCA doesn't actually have an output or an input, it's just a volume of these. So nothing goes out to the stems from the tracks, they just go into the bus, or the sub bus if you like, and then these buses, as well as the reverb or whatever other effects are on the channel, So if there was a delay, that would be there as well, going out on bus 1. And so then that way I know that all of the affecting has already been done. So what's on the return here is already ready to print.
Yeah, great.
And it means that I can automate it if I want to. And I don't generally do automation on this VCA channel. You can if you want.
Yeah, it kind of defeats the point a bit.
Well, yeah, if I was to do that because I wanted all the brass to come up, then all the brass to come down, it would be doing it it would be pulling up the level of the individual channel strips, which could cause clipping. Whereas here, I know that this is the true overall signal summed down, including all the effects. So this is the final stage. And then if I want to do any last minute processing as well, I'll do it here. So if I want to have a general EQ on all the brass, or a general compressor, or there's nothing else that I'd likely really do other than a bit of volume automation, I'll do it here. But I try as much as possible to make sure that all of that is already in the music and already in the dynamics, so that it's minimal at this stage. Same goes for like master bus stuff. Obviously, I've said I'm not really mastering anyway, but you can see even there it's very minimal what I've done. We're going to have to wrap up, guys, because I need to go to an appointment. But I hope that's been helpful.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Huw.
Yeah.
That was really, really fascinating. I understood about a third of what you were saying, so I think that's pretty good.
Well, that's something. We can come back on anything that needs to be cleaned up. One thing I didn't mention, but I'm sure you've seen it, is colors. So organization, as you can see, I'm pretty big on organization, and with something like this, that's crucial. But you can that's self-explanatory. So all the stems are their own color, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, cool. So in the chat, I've put Huw's website. So I'd encourage you guys to check that out, because there's loads. There's another brilliant, a totally different track actually on the homepage that Huw, you were working on in lockdown, kind of adventure soundtrack trailer, which is a more orchestral, less synth heavy thing. So that's another great example of Huw's work.
Actually, if you want to hear some more pure orchestral stuff, check out my Frozen Landscapes library album. I did 4 tracks on that. That's on my website as well. There's still some synths and stuff, but you hear a lot more like pure string writing on that, on a couple of the tracks there.
Is there an email that we can contact you with if we have any random questions? Because I have a few more quite specific things, if that's okay.
And I'd be glad to hear what you guys are actually up to as well. I mean, obviously, I can tell that you guys know what you're talking about, and that you're obviously really into this stuff. So I'd love to, I'd love to help and hear what you're doing. So it's Huw@huwwhite.com. But if you go to my website, you can contact me through the website anyway. So HUW.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah,
no problem.
Yes, just pop that in the chat just then. And guys, before you go, because this is like a standalone session, and we'd like to basically we're getting feedback on the workshops, just so when we go back to management and people and say, what was the point of Inspiration Week? Why did you spend so much money on amazing people like Huw? We can say, well, this is why, because this is what they thought. So because you guys have done similar things in your music production course, but we haven't hosted anything like this in the Music Centre. So if you wouldn't mind doing a bit of feedback, and if you know any of the guys who were here earlier, and you could send that link over to them and ask them, because we might not see them for any of the other workshops, that'd be really, really helpful. But yeah, Huw, let's round of applause for Huw. Thank you so much, Huw. That was
thanks very much.
Yeah, great way to spend an afternoon.
Hopefully I can use the feed to buy the new monitor. That's
yeah. No, it'll be easy. It'll be an easy fix. Yeah,
I'm sure. HDMI cable probably.
Yeah, probably.
But, it's really lovely to meet you guys. Thank you for your time and your questions, and I really hope this has been a help to you, and all the best for your careers and all you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you.
Right. Cheers, everyone. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you, Neil.